Jay-Z, "You're just like Diddy. I can't stand your arrogant, condescending attitude. Nicki posted a video of you wearing a pink wig, and I retweeted it. Nothing more. You deserved it. Everyone knows about our feud. It's been going on for over 20 years. I've seen all your manipulation in the industry, from power struggles to cultural control. In 2015, when Tidal launched, Nicki helped you build it from nobody to a successful platform, and you immediately pocketed her $7.9 million in royalties. Lil Wayne was qualified for the Super Bowl, but you kicked him out of personal grudges. How is that any different from Diddy forcing his artists to sign unfair contracts? Just because Nicki didn't align with him, he resorts to this kind of suppression. You're truly despicable. What's even more interesting is that right after I showed him and his father's photo in the documentary Sean Combs: The Reckoning, you immediately had your lawyer send me a warning letter saying I overstepped my bounds. When you wrote the lyrics to exonerate Diddy back then, why didn't you think about today? You say the film is malicious slander, but why don't you dare sue me for defamation? Because all the evidence I have is true. I haven't finished reporting the witnesses in my documentary, and I haven't released all the Tidal profit sharing documents. If you know what's good for you, pay back what you owe Nicki with interest. Don't wait until I make Jay-Z Reckoning 2, by which time even Beyonce's PR team won't be able to save you.
Jay goes, let's get it straight. Nobody's afraid of 50 Cent.
I want everyone to be clear. No one's scared of 50 Cent.
At that point, his safe presentation, even the glasses, what the glasses represent? Intelligence, right? A nerd, maybe. What are some of the things that come along with you being a nerd? Like, don't hit a guy before. He's not identifying with the transition and difference and the perception of Jay-Z. Now he's really safe, and people feel comfortable with him because they know he's not going to do anything inappropriate or try not to. Meanwhile, when he's saying he's not afraid of 50 Cent, why would you have to make that clear when no one's ever asked me if I'm afraid of Jay-Z?
Today is Monday, February 9th, 2026, and 50 Cent has just dropped part 2 of his new Netflix documentary. And this time, it's not about music. It's about what was hidden, secret parties held far from the public eye, closed-door gatherings with restricted access, late-night parties where cameras were never allowed. According to 50 Cent, these weren't random events. They were controlled environments, private rooms, private timing, familiar faces only. Young girls allegedly present, secret relationships never acknowledged publicly, and powerful names, Sean Diddy Combs and Jay-Z, appearing again and again behind closed doors. Before we go deeper into this video, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss any update. And because everything you're about to hear connects to a story that's been building for years. Back on December 2nd, 2025, 50 Cent released his first Netflix documentary, a 4-part series that raised serious questions but left many details unanswered. Now, with documentary part 2, 50 Cent returns to those unanswered questions. And this time, the focus is sharper. This isn't gossip. This isn't speculation. This is about patterns. Patterns of silence. Patterns of power. And an industry that stayed quiet for far too long. Because when stories are hidden this carefully, the real question isn't what happened. It's who was protected and why.
I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years, and I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
In part 2 of his new Netflix documentary, 50 Cent goes back to something he had only hinted at before. Meetings that were never supposed to exist on paper. No calendars, no schedules, no invitations you could trace. According to 50 Cent, these were secret meetings held far away from public view, not industry mixers, not label events, and not social gatherings meant to be seen. If you didn't already know, you weren't supposed to know at all. The documentary describes alleged gatherings hosted in private locations, chosen specifically for isolation. Places where attention couldn't reach. Places where no one would accidentally walk in. Places designed to disappear the moment they ended. Inside these locations, everything was controlled. Private rooms, private timing, carefully selected attendees, Access wasn't random. It wasn't earned through fame alone. You were either part of the circle or you didn't exist in that space. 50 Cent explains that these rooms followed a different set of rules. Conversations inside them were never meant to leave. No recordings, no notes, no follow-up discussions in public. Whatever was said stayed locked inside the walls. According to the documentary, these weren't casual talks. They were conversations that shaped decisions, relationships, and influence, without leaving behind evidence of how or when they happened. The film then focuses on closed-door parties with restricted entry, not parties meant for celebration, parties built around exclusion. Only familiar faces were allowed inside, the same people appearing again and again. Outsiders weren't welcome. Questions weren't tolerated. And most importantly, our phones were discouraged, sometimes completely banned. No photos, no videos, no digital trail. Records weren't kept because records weren't supposed to exist. 50 Cent frames this as intentional design. According to him, these events were structured to stay undocumented, not by accident, not by coincidence, by design. Names like Sean Diddy Combs and Jay-Z are mentioned in the documentary, not because of what was proven publicly, but because of how often they were linked to environments like these. Spaces where power moved quietly and accountability never entered the room. The documentary is careful with its language. It doesn't claim crimes. It doesn't present verdicts. Instead, it presents a pattern where meetings leave no trace, where conversations have no witnesses, and where influence operates without records. According to 50 Cent, this is how power protects itself, not by erasing evidence, but by never creating it in the first place. And as the documentary makes clear, these meetings weren't isolated moments. They weren't rare exceptions. They were part of a system where silence wasn't just expected, it was required, where access was controlled, and where the outside world was never meant to know what happened once those doors closed. This is where the story truly begins. Because when meetings are designed to stay undocumented, the most important question isn't what was said inside the room. It's why no one was ever supposed to know it happened at all.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming back.
When the sun went down, the public image went with it. In part 2 of his new Netflix documentary, 50 Cent describes a side of the industry that only came alive after dark. Late-night parties that existed outside normal visibility, far away from interviews, cameras, and headlines. These weren't industry celebrations meant to be seen. They weren't award after parties or media events. They were after-hours gatherings where the rules were different. According to the documentary, these nights began when public attention ended, when security tightened, when entrances were controlled, when the expectation was clear. Whatever happened would never be discussed the next day. There was no press waiting outside, no cameras documenting arrivals, no official acknowledgement that the gathering ever took place. In some cases, there wasn't even a public location to point to. 50 Cent explains that these moments were designed to exist only in memory. No photos, no timestamps, no social media traces, just people who were there, and an unspoken understanding that nothing would be repeated. The documentary suggests this wasn't about privacy alone. It was about control, because once nothing is recorded, nothing can be questioned. Part 2 then carefully connects these after-dark gatherings to secret romantic relationships that were never acknowledged openly, not relationships shown in public, not connections explained in interviews. But private involvement deliberately kept far away from public images. Publicly, everything remained clean and controlled. Appearances were separate, narratives were polished. Privately, according to the documentary, those boundaries blurred. Names like Sean Diddy Combs and Jay-Z appear in this section not through accusations, but through contrast. The contrast between public distance and private familiarity. Separate entrances, different exits, carefully managed visibility, connections that were never announced, never confirmed, never denied. But within certain circles, they were quietly understood. 50 Cent frames this as part of a larger pattern. When relationships are never acknowledged, they can't be examined. When nights are never documented, they can't be reconstructed. People didn't take pictures. They didn't ask questions. They didn't speak afterward, because these nights weren't meant to survive daylight. From 50 Cent's perspective, this separation, public image by day, the private reality by night, is where influence operates most comfortably, where accountability weakens, where silence becomes routine. The documentary doesn't tell the audience what to conclude. It simply shows how environments were structured. And as part 2 makes clear, the absence of evidence doesn't mean the absence of behavior. It often means the system worked exactly as intended. These late-night gatherings didn't need witnesses. They didn't need records. They only needed silence. And for years, according to the documentary, that silence held. As part 2 of the Netflix documentary moves forward, the atmosphere changes. This is the point where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable. According to 50 Cent, the documentary raises alleged relationships involving young girls, not presented as proven facts, not shouted as accusations, but introduced as concerns that circulated quietly behind the scenes for years. Not public claims, not official complaints, just conversations that made people uneasy. The documentary describes age-related concerns that were allegedly discussed privately among insiders. Moments when people noticed who was present at certain gatherings and quietly questioned whether everyone in the room should have been there at all. These weren't conversations meant for interviews. They weren't meant for headlines. They stayed behind closed doors. According to the film, the presence of very young individuals at private parties raised serious questions at the time. Questions about boundaries, judgment, and power. But those questions rarely went further than whispers. There were no public statements, no clarifications, no denials. Because nothing was ever said publicly to respond to. Only whispers, shared cautiously, often followed by silence. People knew the stakes. Speaking openly didn't just risk careers, it risked access, protection, and safety within the industry. The documentary also references alleged relationships with men, approached carefully and without sensationalism. The focus is not on sexuality itself, but on secrecy, on how certain aspects of private life were allegedly kept completely separate from public personas. According to the narrative, private identities were tightly compartmentalized. What audiences saw in interviews, performances, and media appearances was polished and controlled. What allegedly existed behind closed doors followed entirely different rules. When names like Sean Diddy Combs and Jay-Z are referenced in this section not as conclusions, but as figures connected to environments where extreme effort was placed on discretion, separation, and silence. Different spaces, different expectations, different realities. 50 Cent frames this secrecy as deliberate. According to the documentary, silence wasn't accidental. It was structural, a system where uncomfortable observations could be dismissed as misunderstandings, and where the absence of evidence became the strongest form of protection. What makes these allegations unsettling isn't how loudly they were raised. It's how quietly they lived. No public reckoning, no clear answers. Just a long-standing awareness among some insiders that certain lines may have been crossed and then carefully erased from public narratives. The documentary does not tell the audience what to believe. Instead, it lays out what people noticed and how little of it was ever allowed to surface. Because sometimes the most disturbing stories aren't the ones shouted into microphones. They're the ones everyone heard, but no one felt safe enough to repeat. As part 2 of the Netflix documentary unfolds, 50 Cent shifts the focus to something the public rarely questions: who had private access to famous names and how that access was managed. According to the documentary, this wasn't about random celebrity overlap. It was about proximity and how carefully that proximity was controlled. The film explores secret relationships with celebrities, describing powerful names moving together privately while maintaining visible distance in public. On red carpets, at award shows, on a end, in interviews, everything appeared separate and professional. But behind closed doors, the familiarity told a different story. Appearances were allegedly choreographed. Who arrived first? Who entered through which door? Who left before cameras returned? Public distance created plausible deniability. Private familiarity preserved influence. The documentary suggests this separation wasn't accidental. It was strategic. When relationships are never acknowledged, they can't be examined. When proximity is hidden, accountability fades. As this section deepens, the film introduces adult misconduct allegations, framed cautiously, without spectacle, and without verdicts. These are not presented as court findings, but as claims insiders say circulated quietly for years. Claims of inappropriate behavior said to happen behind closed doors, and in spaces where access was limited and oversight didn't exist. Not environments open to scrutiny, environments designed to avoid it. What makes these stories unsettling, according to the documentary, isn't a single allegation. It's consistency, similar settings, similar power dynamics, similar outcomes. The film notes that these accounts were described as disturbing, yet repeatedly buried, not denied publicly, not addressed directly, simply absorbed by silence and allowed to disappear from public conversation. Names like Sean Diddy Combs and Jay-Z appear in this chapter, not as conclusions, but as figures repeatedly connected to environments where access mattered more than transparency. 50 Cent emphasizes the imbalance created when fame controls the room. Who gets believed? Who gets ignored? Who feels safe speaking? And who doesn't? The documentary does not claim to expose every truth. Instead, it exposes a pattern. Private access protected by public distance, stories managed through silence, and allegations that never vanished, only went quiet. Because in spaces like these, nothing needs to be erased. It only needs to be kept behind the door. And as Part 2 makes clear, when famous names move privately, the rules change. Not because of what's proven, but because of who is allowed to see. That's where the real power lives. As Part 2 of the Netflix documentary continues, 50 Cent shifts attention to something that was never officially addressed, yet always present. The inner circles no one spoke about. According to the documentary, there were unspoken connections surrounding Sean Diddy Combs and Jay-Z that rarely appeared in interviews, profiles, or public narratives. These weren't collaborators being promoted. They weren't executives being credited. They weren't friends being named. They were simply there, the same faces appearing again and again, at private gatherings, at after-hours events, in restricted spaces where access was limited. Yet publicly, those faces were never explained. The documentary suggests these were private inner circles, groups that operated quietly, consistently, and without definition. People who didn't need titles to belong, people whose presence alone signaled trust and access. What makes this unsettling, according to 50 Cent's framing, isn't that inner circles exist. They always do. It's that these circles were never acknowledged. No confirmations, no denials, no clarifications, just silence. Over years, the same individuals reappeared in the same private environments while remaining absent from public storytelling. Interviews skipped over them, timelines omitted them, narratives moved forward without ever naming who stood closest. The documentary describes these as off-record relationships, connections maintained quietly, protected by discretion rather than transparency. Associations that were neither confirmed nor denied, allowing them to exist without scrutiny. And that ambiguity, the film suggests, was intentional, because when relationships are never defined, they can't be examined. When names are never spoken, accountability dissolves. When proximity is never explained, patterns remain invisible. 50 Cent emphasizes that in powerful environments, silence isn't empty. It's protective. By never acknowledging these connections, the story stayed clean. The public saw influence and success, but never dependency, repetition, or structure. Silence became armor. The documentary doesn't accuse these inner circles of specific actions. Instead, it exposes the mechanism that kept them intact: proximity without explanation, access without labels, and loyalty enforced through discretion. People inside these circles understood the rules without them being stated. No photos, no questions, no stories afterward. And over time, that silence became normal. No one asked why the same people were always present. No one questioned how long they'd been there. No one pressed for clarity because there was nothing official to challenge. According to the documentary, these inner circles weren't hidden in shadows. They were hiding in plain sight. And in an industry trained to avoid uncomfortable questions, that silence did more than protect individuals. It protected the entire structure. Because when everyone agrees not to speak, silence stops looking suspicious. It starts looking like the way things have always been. As part 2 of the Netflix documentary unfolds, 50 Cent widens the lens, moving away from individual moments and towards something far more complex. Industry alliances hiding in plain sight. According to the documentary, some of the most influential relationships in music were never meant to be obvious. They didn't show up in press releases, they weren't announced in interviews, and they rarely appeared in official business records. They existed behind the scenes. 50 Cent describes a world of quiet coordination, conversations that happened off camera, on understandings that never needed to be written down, phone calls instead of emails, side conversations instead of meetings, agreements that didn't require signatures to function. Publicly, everything looks separate. Different labels, different camps, different narratives. Privately, the documentary suggests there was alignment. Artists and executives who appeared divided in public allegedly moved in sync when it mattered most. When controversy surfaced, responses slowed. When questions grew louder, silence followed. Not denial, just delay. This is where the idea of mutual protection through silence comes into focus. According to 50 Cent, silence wasn't passive, it was strategic. If no one spoke, no one had to explain. If no one confirmed, no one could be challenged. If no one addressed an issue directly, it eventually faded from public attention. The documentary revisits unverified accusations first raised during Part 1. Claims that never disappeared, only drifted out of headlines. Not disproven, not resolved, simply left unanswered. Now in Part 2, 50 Cent brings those unanswered questions back into view. Why were certain allegations never followed up? Why did specific names stop coming up? Why did the conversation move on without clarity? Figures like Diddy Combs and Jay-Z are referenced in this chapter not as conclusions, but as recurring points within a broader pattern. A pattern where public separation existed alongside private alignment. The documentary does not argue that everyone involved shared the same intentions. Instead, it highlights how systems protect themselves. When alliances run deep enough, the truth doesn't need to be confronted immediately. It can be managed, deferred, quieted, and over time, deferral becomes silence. 50 Cent doesn't present this as a single conspiracy. He presents it as a culture, one where relationships matter more than transparency, and where unresolved questions are treated as inconveniences rather than problems to solve. Because in an industry built on access and leverage, breaking silence can be more dangerous than breaking rules. As Part 2 makes clear, some of the strongest alliances weren't hidden in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight, protected by familiarity, maintained through silence, and left untouched because too many people benefited from keeping them that way. And once you recognize that pattern, the unanswered questions from Part 1 stop feeling accidental, and they start feeling intentional. As Part 2 of the Netflix documentary moves deeper, 50 Cent focuses on where influence truly operates. Inside private spaces, not stages, not interviews, not public appearances, private rooms. According to the documentary, there were unconfirmed associations tied to Diddy Combs and Jay-Z that never appeared in official records. These weren't relationships you could point to in press articles or timelines. They didn't exist publicly, but they were carefully preserved privately. The film suggests these bonds were never acknowledged because acknowledgement would invite questions, so instead they were quietly maintained and simultaneously erased from interviews, profiles, and narratives. Names omitted, proximity edited out, familiarity reduced to coincidence. Inside these private environments, where power worked differently, access wasn't accidental, entry wasn't equal. According to 50 Cent's framing, influence decided who got in and who stayed out. Invitations didn't circulate. Doors didn't open to everyone. Decisions were made long before anyone arrived, and once the room was set, the hierarchy was already established. These spaces operated on unspoken rules. Proximity meant favor. Distance meant exclusion. Silence meant understanding. The documentary describes power dynamics that controlled access, not through force, but through familiarity. If you were there, you belonged. If you weren't supposed to know the room existed at all. This is also where the film raises significant age gap concerns that insiders allegedly whispered about, but rarely confronted. Not presented as public accusations, but as alarms raised quietly, then lowered just as quickly. Concerns mentioned in private conversations and then dropped when it became clear how much influence was at stake. What mattered wasn't only age, it was imbalance. Who held power, who depended on access, and who had the ability, or inability, to question either. 50 Cent doesn't claim every private space was the same, or that every association implied wrongdoing. Instead, he points to the structure: relationships protected by privacy, narratives curated by omission, and accountability weakened by controlled access. When relationships are never acknowledged, they can't be examined. When access is controlled, scrutiny disappears. And in these private spaces, according to the documentary, power didn't need to announce itself. It was enforced by who was allowed inside and by how quietly everyone else was kept outside. This chapter doesn't end with answers. It ends with tension, because once influence moves out of public view, it stops being shared and starts being guarded. And for those on the outside, the most troubling part isn't what was proven. It's what was never allowed to be asked.